Are you concerned about the future of our great state and country? Could nullification be the game changer for the health and security of our state and our nation? You've heard us talk a lot about nullification before, but tonight you'll learn all about it firsthand from the author of the House bill, Representative Bud Hulsey. We'll also be discussing the need for real money, legal tender, and gold bullion. Let's go ahead and get started. The Tennessee Informer starts now. Hello and welcome to the Tennessee Informer. I'm your host, Dave Vance. Before we bring our special guest out tonight, Representative Bud Hulsey from District 2, who will be discussing nullification with us, is a little personal commentary on some topics of importance. If you have an announcement from a conservative organization that you would like announced on this show, please send the information to tennesseeinformer.tv@gmail.com the Friday before the show. Thoughts to consider. You have to know your rights to defend them. If you're not instructing your state legislators on important issues, they are still being instructed by feckless state leaders, the Chamber of Commerce, numerous lobbyists, and other well-heeled scum that roam the hills of the Capitol, the halls of the Capitol, that is. Article 1 of the Declaration of Rights of the Tennessee Constitution, Section 1 says that all power is inherent in the people, and all free governments are founded on their authority and instituted for their peace, safety, and happiness. For the advancement of those ends, they have at all times an unalienable and indefeasible right to alter, reform, or abolish the government in such manner as they may think proper. Section 2, that government being instituted for the common benefit, the doctrine of non-resistance against arbitrary power and oppression is absurd, slavish, and destructive of the good and happiness of mankind. Article 11, Miscellaneous Provisions, Section 16 from the Constitution. The Declaration of Rights hereto prefixed is declared to be part of the Constitution of the state and shall never be violated on any pretense whatever. And to guard against transgression of the high powers we have delegated, we declare that everything in the Bill of Rights contained is accepted out of the general powers of the government and shall forever remain inviolate. Not being slavish and absurd applies to federal actions as well. And if you want our state to step up and push back on our overreaching, often unconstitutional federal government, visit tncss.weebly.com and learn more about the legislation we hope to get passed this session that creates multiple processes for nullifying unconstitutional federal actions. The SEC of the state, that's the State Executive Committee of the Republican Party, recently passed a resolution in support of this legislation, as have the county commissions in Jefferson, Sullivan, and Roane counties. More are in the works. Additionally, TNCSS has coordinated for Chris Ann Hall to appear live Saturday, February 24th from 10 to 12:30 at the Dynamic Ballroom and Performing Arts Center in Mount Juliet, Tennessee. This is a free but limited seating event and you must RSVP. Go to the events tab on tncss.weebly.com for more details. Chris Ann will be focusing on the issue of nullification. On that note, we are getting close to our max number of seats, so if you're interested, you need to RSVP ASAP. On the issue of nullification, I want to give thanks real quick to WDXE in Lawrenceburg Radio. Chris Morris and Lawrence Sutton did a great job on the Kip Capley show last night talking about this issue. So I encourage you to listen to that broadcast. Our guest tonight is the House sponsor of the nullification bill, which is, in my opinion, the most constitutionally important legislation being presented this year, especially given how out of control our federal government is. Now for just a little bit of background on our guest. Representative Bud Hulsey lives in Kingsport, has 3 children. He's a retired police lieutenant. He did his postgraduate work at the University of Virginia via FBI National Academy. He's got a BA from Bob Jones University in Greenville, South Carolina, and graduated high school in Durango, Colorado. Thank you for coming on tonight. How are you, Bud?
Thank you, Dave. I appreciate the time to spend with you. I'm doing all right, I guess.
Full day, another full day at session, huh?
It's been a long day. They always are.
Yeah. Well, we appreciate what you do up there. Your nullification bill was refiled last week. It has a new number. So House Bill 0726 is now House Bill 2795, and the Senate companion bill was 1092. It's now 2775, still sponsored by Senator Bowling. Any other changes to the bill other than the number?
There were some small little changes towards the last portion of the bill where we had talked about in that system devising or setting out the penalties and what the penalties would be. And it seemed to have a kind of a process problem. So in this bill, everything stays the same except it says that you have to determine after you vote to pass it, the floor and the Senate has to determine what penalties are going to go in it. And it stays the same as far as it can't be killed in a committee, and it has to go for a vote. It's a forced vote on the House and the Senate floor. Oh. But those are just some small technical changes. Everything else is the same.
Okay. For those that might not have a good understanding of nullification, can you tell the audience what it is and why it's important?
Yeah, nullification, actually, the word was used by Thomas Jefferson and some others too, but it's a better word for it, I guess, would be ignoring in one way. But nullification is a process where a state says when the federal government overreaches in areas that they don't belong in, or edicts come out of Washington that are unconstitutional. And for example, when an executive order comes out of the president's mouth, executive orders are only supposed to apply to the executive branch. But when they apply to the people, then now the president makes law, and of course the president can't make law because of the separation of powers. So when something like that happens, this nullification gives a state a process to say to the federal government, you've gone beyond the powers that the Constitution gives you, and what you're doing is unconstitutional, and we are not going to abide by it in this state. We're going to ignore it here, and no state money will be used to try and force it. No state resources, no state people. We're going to ignore that in this state. And that's basically the process of what nullification is.
So you said, making it void and ignoring it. And that's, Texas is a good example of that right now. And of course, they have a lawsuit going with the federal government. But recently, I guess a week or two ago, the Supreme Court basically told them that they had to allow the federal government to remove the barriers down there on the border. And so they didn't actually have to pass any legislation. They just decided, okay, we're not going to go along with that. We're going to ignore it. When you ignore it, you make it null and void. And I was glad to see that and I was glad to see the support it got from our state and others standing up for Texas on this. Because, I think there's a lot of other lines that have been crossed in the past, but everybody with any sense sees that this is a line, this has gone too far. Essentially, the Supreme Court told Texas, well, because the federal government, because we have decided that they get to make all the calls on anything related to immigration, you don't have a right to defend yourself. And I'm glad that I'm glad that Texas said no, and the other states realized that was just a bridge too far, and that, that the federal government had to be stood up to, had to be ignored in this case. And I was glad to see that.
Yeah, that's a pretty good example of nullification right there. It's nullifying some order that the court gave that's unconstitutional.
Right. And I think we should have done that. I'm glad everybody agreed to that line, but there's a lot of other lines that have been crossed over the years. The Supreme Court deciding, okay, states, your school districts, they can't have prayer. Well, whether you think, I would be hard pressed today to find a school district I would trust with prayer, but regardless of that, it's not the federal government's place to tell our school districts that and our states that. It wasn't the federal government's place to tell us that we had to allow abortions all those years, or that we had to allow gay marriage. So there's a lot of lines that have been crossed. I'm glad finally some of our states found a line that they would stand up for, or so far appear to stand up for.
Yeah, I agree with you. And there's been other cases of nullification down through the years, and you had pointed out once before when we talked before that right here in this, when COVID was going on, we ran a resolution. The speaker and the lieutenant governor both ran resolutions when Biden came out with the edict that every employer was going to make their employees take a shot whether they wanted or not. We ran a joint resolution here saying, no, if you push this, we'll nullify that in Tennessee. We'll ignore it. We're not doing it.
Yeah.
And the Real ID Act, the government's come out with that, 16, 17 years ago?
Yeah.
And 12 states said, we'll nullify that. We're not doing that. And so it's still never come to pass. And you've got probably 40 different federal laws on the books dealing with marijuana. And that's law. I mean, it's federal law. But you've got 22 plus states that have said, hey, that's not even in your bailiwick. This is not one of the 18 enumerated powers that you've got. And we're going to pass our own state law, and we're going to grow it, and we're going to sell it, and we're going to smoke it, and we're going to tax it. And that's what they did. And they nullified about 40 different federal laws. You go back to the Sedition Act, where Congress passed a law and said you can't speak against the president or against the legislature, Congress. And that's when the two resolutions came out of Virginia and Kentucky, that we get some of the quotes where Jefferson used the word nullification.
Right.
And said, it's null and void if it violates the Constitution. But it's nothing new, and those conversations came about a long time ago with the men when the Constitution was written.
Oh yeah, I think it's gotten worse in the last 100 years how much we've deferred to the federal government on pretty much anything and everything, and especially the courts. We've held them up as as above the Constitution. That their word is the Constitution. That has not worked out well, and that was not the intent. I mean, if you think about it, you mentioned Article 1, Section 8, lays out the federal powers. Article 1, Section 10 lists the things the states cannot do. And then, of course, the 10th Amendment, the Bill of Rights, says that the powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution or prohibited by the states are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. So how else are states supposed to enforce that but nullification?
Well, you're exactly right. I mean, you either accept tyranny and an ever-growing central powerful government, which, even during the Revolution, they said that it was taxation without representation, but that's not what it was. That was a little teeny piece that came after the act that the British Parliament passed that says the king is sovereign. Yeah. And anything he says is sovereign, and his laws are sovereign, and you'll obey it. And boy, that's what started it.
Yeah,
is who is sovereign over somebody's body or their state or their family, who has sovereignty.
Yeah,
and that's where it all began. But it's my conviction, Dave, if we're going to survive in this republic, to me, two things are going to have to happen. We need a revival in the church, and we need state legislatures who are going to stand up and say, anytime there's an overreach by the federal government, it's not one of the enumerated things they have the right to do, and it's unconstitutional on its face. State legislatures are going to have to say we're not doing that here if we're going to survive. Absolutely. That's what I believe.
Absolutely. Divine intervention and state intervention. And we're going to have to pray for one, and you got to force the others, because I appreciate you and some of the others up there, but you unfortunately appear to be in the minority overall. Now this latest issue with Texas gives you some hope, but we're still going to have to really, it's going to take a good effort by the people pushing for this. But we're either going to accept total tyranny and basically having only the rights that they give us, or we're going to stand up and enforce the Constitution. And as you can see, and I know you've seen it in your lifetime, I've seen it in mine, every time you give them an inch, they take a yard. Every time. And if you don't push back and push back right away and push back consistently, they just keep doing it. And whether it's an executive order, whether it's a regulation from one of the many unconstitutional agencies that our federal government has created, or whether it's the Supreme Court just creating things out of whole cloth, when we accept it, when our states accept it, they're complicit.
Yeah, you're exactly right. And one of the arguments, well, it's not an argument. It's we've been conditioned for the last 100 years, and law schools have taught it, that when a question comes up, who determines what's constitutional or unconstitutional? Who makes that decision? Well, for 100 years plus, or maybe thereabouts, we've been conditioned in this country to believe that only the Supreme Court can do that. Well, of course, the Constitution doesn't charge the Supreme Court with determining whether laws out of Congress are constitutional or not. In fact, the boys that lived back then and the founders said that's absurd to believe that an arm of government could decide whether the rest of the government's doing the right thing or the wrong thing. That's kind of insane. But the question came up a long time ago on who decides. And if you go look at the Federalist Papers, which some of your viewers probably know that the Federalist Papers were written by Hamilton and Madison and John Jay, and there were letters to the editors of papers in New York. And the thinking, I think, was that if they could convince New York to ratify the Constitution, the rest of the states would probably follow suit. And so there were a series of letters called the Federalist Papers, and they dealt with questions that people had and issues that they were fighting over and arguing over about the Constitution. And those three boys wrote those letters, and it was interesting because when that question came up of who decides what's constitutional or not, in Federalist 16, I think, I can't remember if Hamilton wrote that or Madison wrote it, it says the people are the natural guardians of the Constitution. Then in Federalist 46 and 16, they said state governments. Right. So that was their thinking, is that state legislatures are in a better position. They're next to the people. They're in a better position to look and decide whether this is constitutional or not constitutional to decide, but it certainly wasn't the Supreme Court.
Right. Well, and the states created the federal government. It's not a compact between the federal government and the states. The federal government is a creation of the states. So to think that the states would create a federal government to do limited things, to have limited powers, you list limited powers, but then because of a misunderstanding, and I think a deliberate distortion of the supremacy clause, where only the laws passed in pursuance of the Constitution, constitutional laws, that's the law of the land, not just any federal law, not just any executive order, or not just any federal court opinion. It's got to be something that's in line with the Constitution. And to think that they would turn over all that power to, I think, matter of fact, at the time, I don't think they had 9 on the Supreme Court. I think they only had 5. So that just doesn't make sense, and it makes really a lot of the other, if you take that approach that the court gets to decide everything, then Article 1, Section 8, all the enumerated powers, that doesn't mean anything. It means absolutely nothing, and the 10th Amendment means nothing. I mean, really, if that was, you shouldn't have listed all those other things if ultimately the court was going to be able to be the one to decide all these issues.
Yeah, and it would be amazing, wouldn't it, that one clause in the Constitution would trump the rest of the Constitution?
Yep, absolutely.
That makes absolutely no sense. That's insane. Yeah. Part of what you were talking about, the pushback I get is from lawyers. And, of course, it just makes me thank God I didn't go to law school. But that's the kind of pushback I get is from them, is that the state doesn't have a right to do that, that the federal government, the Supreme Court, is who determines these things, and if you have a grievance, that's the route you have to go. And some lawyers say, well, you can't. It's wrong or it's unconstitutional to nullify anything, and they get that idea, I think, from what was called the nationalist theory of the Union, which was espoused by Joseph Story, and you probably read it. In fact, he wrote commentaries on the Constitution of the United States, and that's taught in law school a great deal. Actually, Webster was one of those boys also, and they believed that it wasn't the states, it was the people, the aggregate total of the people that was what counted, and that was the systematic nationalist theory is what Story taught, and that's what law schools teach. It's not states and the people in the individual people in the individual states. It's the aggregate collective of all the people. But what's interesting about that is, a guy named Abel Upshur wrote commentaries to refute what Joseph Story had said. And Upshur had a whole lot of boys lined up with him in the same, but he viewed it as a compact theory, rather than the nationalist theory. And what's interesting about that is the boys who wrote the Constitution believed what Upshur said, and they believed that it was a state issue. It wasn't just aggregate collection of people.
Right.
And I didn't know this till I was reading, but the Constitution, when they first wrote it, it started out, "We the states, not we the people."
Right. And there was some concern over that wording of "we the people."
It was. Yep, it sure was. And I think, what was it called? The Committee of Style, I think it was.
Right.
That changed the words because they thought it would be presumptuous to assume that everybody would ratify the Constitution. And so they didn't want to offend anybody. So then they changed it and said, "We the people." But yeah, there was a whole... It's how they viewed that then, and when Story's position caught hold, it was almost like the federal government was supreme and the Constitution wasn't. And when you come down that line, instead of looking at the states as having the power, which they do, and that's why you have a 10th Amendment, because there's only 18 things that the federal government's supposed to mess around in. Absolutely everything else is left to the power of the people in the states, and that's why you have a 10th Amendment.
Right.
But if it was an aggregate thing, there would be no 10th Amendment. Yeah. They wouldn't even put it in there. But.
Well, and the states would not have ratified, the people would not have ratified the Constitution if they thought that they were going to be creating a super legislature or a super judiciary. If you remember, the federal plan, the Virginia plan, was for a top-down government, and that was rejected just boom, right off the top. Now, that doesn't mean that the people that supported that actually gave up that idea, but that is not what they passed. And the reason we have Bill of Rights is because there was a fear that they were creating a federal government that was going to be too powerful. And the Federalist Papers that you mentioned in those arguments, the papers, Federalist Papers directly refuted a lot of the arguments that were being made against the Constitution, saying that it would give it too much power. And they mentioned certain things like the Necessary and Proper Clause, the General Welfare Clause, the Supremacy Clause.
Yep.
They mentioned all those things, and they explained why that was not the proper way to interpret it. And they reminded people that, hey, the federal government has limited enumerated powers. Everything else belongs to states. So the things that these people, the anti-federalists, are telling you are not true. Now, as it turns out, the anti-federalists have been right in the way this has been distorted, but that's because over time, people have allowed it to be, our states have allowed it to go that way. Obviously, the Civil War didn't help that situation, but even after the Civil War, for a long time, you didn't have near as much federal involvement. I mean, really till the 30s, until, after the 30s is when we started having all this federal involvement in our states.
Well, yeah, and by the way, my bill, and I got to tell you this too, I didn't write this bill. I have met with a group of men up on my end of the state up here dealing with this issue of what's the best way to proceed. And we've met and did trial runs and worked on some wording and that kind of thing. And they're just good, solid patriot men. And anyway, after throwing ideas together of how the best to do it, actually Jeff Cobble, who you probably know, he's a constitutional lawyer out of Greenville. He actually wrote the bill. But that came from several meetings, many meetings over a few years with those men to try and get this right. And the bill, this nullification bill, doesn't force the legislature to do anything. It just says that nullification is a constitutional process that a state has at its disposal and can use and has a rightful reason to use it when the federal government does unconstitutional overreach. And so if you choose to nullify, here's 5 ways you can do it. That's what the bill says. And it gives the 5 ways you can do it. So it doesn't make the legislature do anything. It just says if you're going to nullify, here's 5 ways to get it done.
Yeah. Now, you mentioned earlier the resolution that they passed in 2021, which stated that, hey, as a sovereign state, we have the right to nullify. Matter of fact, we take oaths, so we have the responsibility to nullify. And oh, by the way, we're not limited to just taking the federal government to court. So they've already said those things. Your bill primarily just kind of echoes those sentiments and then lays out the process. So can you talk about some of the different processes for possibly nullifying a bill? And I think we may have some corresponding slides, but if not, I know you can explain them well enough.
Yeah, the bill mentions 5 ways that the legislature can nullify something. The first way is if the governor, if the federal government in some portion or arm of it puts out an unconstitutional edict that affects the executive branch of Tennessee government that the governor's over, the governor can nullify that right there. Say we're not doing that. It's unconstitutional.
That would apply just to the executive branch, not necessarily to the whole state. Okay.
Not the whole state. Yes, it would apply to the executive branch.
Okay.
A second way is if a judge in a court case, a seated judge in a court case, has a piece in that court that is from the federal side, and the judge believes that that is unconstitutional, he can nullify that piece of whatever federal piece he's dealing with in his court. He can nullify that. And by the way, people say, well, if a judge can nullify, well, shoot, a jury can nullify. A jury has a right to nullify law. The criminal court judges don't tell jurors that anymore, but you got a right to nullify law. And why is that important, and why is that even an issue? Well, it's because everybody in government takes an oath, the very same oath that's dictated by the Constitution, that you're going to uphold the Constitution of the United States. So if it's only the Supreme Court that can decide anything, then it should be only the Supreme Court that takes the oath of office. Everybody else doesn't matter. But the judge can do that.
Now he can nullify, or he can recommend that the legislature nullify.
No, he can take whatever piece from the federal side that's involved in his court that he believes to be unconstitutional. He can remove that and not act on it.
Okay.
The next way is the legislature can file a bill of nullification. Now, like I said, there's some caveats to it. If we file a bill in the House side or the Senate side, and the rules are in the bill that you can haggle it out, you can argue about it, you can debate it, which you should, but you can't kill it, and you can't kill it in a committee. It has to go to the House floor, and it has to be debated. And when the debate's over, it has to be decided what the penalties are going to be for violation of it. And then you have to vote on it, up or down, yes or no.
Now, you said the legislature, it can be just one representative or one senator, correct, that brings this issue up?
Right. Exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
It'd be like any other. It'd be like any other bill that you submit. It just cannot get killed in committee.
Well, it doesn't go to committee, right? It just goes to the full floor.
No, it goes to the floor. It bypasses the committee, and it goes to the floor, and that's where you debate it, and that's where you vote on it. And there's not any other bill like that that's ever been done. They used to do it that way on the House floor because they didn't have as many bills as we got now. But
they didn't have as many lobbyists.
Nope, you didn't. But that's how it used to be done. But that's the way that's the other way that a bill can be introduced of nullification. Then there's two more ways, and one of them is if you get 2,000 signatures on a petition of nullification sent to the Speaker. Now these are 2,000 signatures of registered voters, and they can all be from the same county or they can be from different counties. If they're from different counties, they need to be bundled together by county so they're easier to make sure that they're a registered voter in that county.
Right.
But you get 2,000 signatures on a petition requesting a bill of nullification on a specific issue, a specific federal overreach. You submit it to the Speaker's office. The Speaker, when the signatures are verified, he assigns it to a legislator to run a bill of nullification over the issue that was on the petition. And then it goes through the same process that is if a legislator had done the same thing. And then the last way is if you have any combination of 10 county governments or city governments, municipal governments, any combination of 10 of those can submit the same letter or petition to the Speaker for a bill of nullification on whatever issue they're wanting, and then that goes through the same process. So there's 5 different ways it can be done.
Now, on those last 3, when they take it to the floor, can there be an amendment? Can amendments be proposed from the original bill or the original complaint, however you want to look at it?
Yeah. That hasn't come up, but I suspect the body has a right to put any amendment on there they want to, but they cannot ignore the issue of nullification that they're dealing with, whatever it is. They can't ignore it. They have to vote on it.
Right.
But that's interesting. I haven't been asked that, but I suspect they would have every right to amend it one way or the other if they thought the need was there.
Right. Now, and just so the people out there that maybe don't know much about the state legislature, it's a big deal not going to committee because generally speaking, committee, with a regular bill, it's made or broken in committee. Okay, if you don't make it to the committee, you don't make it to the floor. And when people want something killed, especially the leadership, or well-heeled scum in some cases, they want it killed, they get it killed in committee, and there's a lot of different ways to do that. So the fact that it skips the committees, that is a big deal. And then it gets to the floor, and they have that. Also, everybody is then on the record. That's another downside to the committee system is when good bills get killed in committee, then there's a lot of people that never got a chance to vote on that, okay? And you don't have any record. They can tell you, well, hey, I wish it had made it out of committee. I would have supported it. Well, you will know one way or the other when this gets to the floor, House or Senate, who supported it and who didn't.
That's true. There's no way to hide it. Your name goes up there on the board, and you push a green button or a red button, and then there's a record of it. It goes down on how you voted. Yeah. But that like I say, that hasn't been done here in a long time.
Right. Now, how often can one issue be brought up? So if regardless of the process, a particular issue is brought up, how often can that issue be brought back? What's the time frame on that?
It's 1 year. Now, you can run as many nullification bills as you want to, but if you can only run one every year that's dealing with the same specific topic.
Every year or every?
I said that.
I'm sorry. Every year or every session?
No, every year. You could bring it up to next year.
Okay. Okay. All right. Because the sessions are 2 years. I mean, I know you know that, but some of the audience might not know that the sessions are 2 years. So, okay, great.
They are, but you can do this every year.
Okay, good. All right. So, what are you hearing? I mean, I know this bill has gotten some attention. What do you think? What kind of support do you think you're going to have? And of course, the Senate's a whole nother ball game. It's ugly over there. But let's just talk about the House side.
You know, the House, I think there's a lot of House Republicans that are amenable to this bill. Like I was telling you, the law school boys get heartburn over it, but it's because of the way they've been taught.
Right.
But any reasonable person, I mean, if you're reasonable, you have to say, yeah, from where we came from and what is constitutional, the federal government is way, way, way out of control.
Yeah.
I mean, anybody would have to say that. It's surprising how many people don't know what the Constitution says. Yeah. It's how many people, it's amazing on how many people believe that it's the Supreme Court that's supreme, not the Constitution. Yeah. The point that you made is a really big one, that law that's passed in Congress is not supreme unless it's constitutional. Right. If it's one of the 18 things and the bill itself, the way it's written, doesn't violate the Constitution, then that is supreme. But the Supreme Court's not supreme, and every law that Congress passes is not supreme. Right. It has to be laws that are pursuant to the Constitution. So most people don't understand that. Most people don't realize that. Most people, I don't think, have really read the Constitution. Most people don't understand that there's only 18 things that they gave them permission to meddle around in. So you look at 90% of what the federal government does, and it's out of their bailiwick. They have no business being in.
Now, most of our debt is for unconstitutional things. The vast majority of the things we're in debt for, and there's no way we'll ever get this debt paid off, are for things that are unconstitutional. So I would say that, you know, anybody that doesn't believe in nullification, if you think we have to stick with what we've done for the better part of 100 years now and defer to the courts and let them make up, that's a big part of why we're in the mess we're in.
Yeah. We have acquiesced for years. And as a result, you know, we're to the place where the federal government meddles in just about absolutely everything.
Yeah.
And I had to argue down here. It's amazing to me, too, even with Republican people, you know, when you start questioning fundamentals, you know, who has sovereignty over their body? I ran a bill back in COVID that said no, the state government nor any municipal government or county government cannot force somebody to take a COVID-19 shot against their will. Well, you'd think that'd be a sail-through easy deal in a Republican-controlled House. Well, it wasn't. and even some Republican boys in some of these committees, they said, well, look, you know, public health is an issue. And I would have to say, well, your public health is an issue, but a state of emergency or public health does not negate the Constitution of the United States.
Right.
It's the Constitution, whether you're sick or whether you're well. It doesn't matter. And I remember this. They wanted to hang an amendment in one of these committees. They wanted to hang an amendment on my bill that said they wanted to exempt police and fire and guards at the penitentiary. And so when they were looking at this amendment they wanted to hang on there, I said, look what you're doing. You would never think of forcing 21,000 inmates in 14 penitentiaries in Tennessee to take a shot they don't want. It would never cross your mind to do that. But you want to force the guard that guards them to take a shot. What are you saying? You're saying that the sovereignty of the inmate has more value than the sovereignty of the man who guards him.
Yep.
How unconstitutional is that? But it's just you fight things like that you would not think that you would, and it's because our minds, I think, have been so cluttered up, and we've acquiesced for so long that we you have to sometimes start again and sell the fundamentals from the very beginning. Hey, who's sovereign?
Right.
And is the state sovereign or is the federal government sovereign? Is the Supreme Court sovereign? Is an edict out of Biden's mouth sovereign?
Yeah.
And you have to go back and answer those fundamental questions, I think.
And nullification is not an argument that the legitimate powers of the federal government that we're challenging those. I mean, like you said, they've got 18 enumerated. And of course, the necessary and proper, that goes along with the 18 enumerated. That's not additional. The necessary and proper are not additional, pull it out of a hat authority for legislation. They're related to the enumerated ones. And so for instance, nobody would think that a state could go independently, deploy troops overseas, okay, or independently do things that are clearly a federal responsibility. But on the other hand, they balk at when something is clearly a state responsibility, like marriage. They balk at the states saying, well, hey, we're not going to. And Tennessee was a really, an example, because we had a state constitution that said marriage is between one man and one woman. And our legislature just folded. Just folded.
Yep.
I mean, that was
sure did.
That was pathetic. So I'm hoping that with what has happened in Texas, that people realize where we are. Our federal government is the biggest threat to our Constitution. Our federal government is the way they act now, the things they do now with all the unconstitutional agencies, they are the most unconstitutional entity in existence right now. They are the biggest threat to our liberty, our freedom, our prosperity. It's all the federal government. If our state and our states don't realize this now and start stepping up, we are toast. As a country, we're toast.
Yeah, that's why I say at the very beginning, that was the whole issue that started the Revolutionary War, was they had lived with an all-powerful central government, and they didn't want it, and they would have never created a federal government like the one they got out from under. They would never have done it.
Yeah.
So that's why you have the 10th Amendment. By the way, you said something that's really important. A state cannot nullify constitutional law. If Congress passes a law, it's in their bailiwick. It's one of the 18 things that they can mess around in. You cannot nullify a constitutional law. So nullification doesn't nullify just something because you don't like it.
Right.
Nullification deals with unconstitutional acts out of Congress. That's what it deals with. And then all you're trying to do as a state is force the federal government to obey the Constitution. That's all you're doing. People thought that the Constitution was written with an overarching issue of bestowing rights. But, of course, the men who wrote it didn't say that. They said that rights come from God in the Declaration.
Yep.
The Constitution was written by these states, and it was written for the biggest purpose as to be changed to bind down this federal government.
Right.
To keep them from becoming supreme and becoming all powerful.
Right.
So when you see it like that, of course, then the nullification is just a push to make the federal government obey the Constitution.
Yeah. And our our U.S. reps, they take an oath to the U.S. Constitution, so they should not be passing laws they know that are unconstitutional. But just because they pass unconstitutional laws is not an excuse for our state legislature, because they take an oath to uphold both the federal and the state constitution. And they are the final line. You guys are really the final line of defense. I mean, if the legislature fails, then we're either all going to live under tyranny, okay, or then we have to break out the Second Amendment and put it to use. I'd much rather use the 10th than the 2nd, okay? Don't get me wrong, there's a lot of people who deserve a Second Amendment solution, but we're all much better off just following the Constitution, using the 10th. And so when legislators take that oath, if you're a state legislator and you don't believe in nullification, how do you intend to uphold your oath?
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Well, you've got some other important bills this session, as every year. Every year you run some good stuff. So I think we've covered this pretty good, and people are going to hear more about this in the coming days, and I thank you for running this. I appreciate Janice Bowling running the Senate version, 2775, and we've got to get her some help in the Senate. But you know, especially because our federal government is so incompetent and so corrupt, you know, money is an issue. And sound money is an issue. And you've got a few bills. You're the House sponsor for a couple of bills that deal with that issue. If you could talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, thank you. Frank Nicely and I have been working for, 8 years, I guess, on a gold depository. And thought we had this over the finish line about 2 years ago, and something foiled it. But we got a bill now on a state gold depository. Of course, it'll take some time to get that up and running, but it is it's a bill that actually works, establishes a private and a state partnership to where the state oversees it, but it's contracted out. And the state stores gold bullion in it, and the state audits it, and the state oversees it. But it's really important because people need a secure place that's not tied to the Federal Reserve, and also the state needs gold bullion, and we need to purchase gold bullion, and that's wrapped up in another one of these bills where it dovetails with what we passed last year to purchase gold bullion. Right now, I think the plan would be to store it in a Texas depository till we get one here. But it's not just a hedge. Some of the financial things in the world and in our country scare me a lot. And we just you probably read some of the thing about the Universal Commercial Code. Right. I've got a bill dealing with that to try to save people's retirements. Most people get horrified when they don't know, and I didn't know either, that they changed the wording back in '94. But the reason they changed the wording is because they anticipated a huge monetary collapse. And they were looking at ways to retrieve losses, and one of the ways was to change the wording on your stocks and bonds and your retirements and your 401ks and your investments from a piece of stock that you actually owned, so they call it an entitlement. And the way the wording is if they go belly up,
you're not
they
entitled.
Can come nope, you're not, and they'll come clean you out. And so I've been working with the Heartland Institute, and I think North Dakota is running this same bill, and it's a way to protect people. But it all dovetails in with money, and when you have gold bullion, the state has it. It's not just a hedge, but it gives you several other options to survive and to help Tennessee people survive. You could store gold in a depository just like that, and there's some really sound programs where you can do transactional business just like a credit card, but it takes not funds or dollar bills, but it takes an amount off of your gold bullion, and it transfers it, changes it into money, cash, and pays for whatever you buy. But you can run that program if you had a total complete currency collapse, you could run and still be able to survive on that. But there's those bills, and then there's a bill that makes gold and silver legal tender. And what that means, it doesn't mean that you walk into the Walmart with a chunk of gold and want to pay for something. What it does is for gold bullion. When you declare gold, silver, and precious metals legal, gold and silver is legal tender, it sets it up where you shouldn't have to pay capital gains tax on it, and that's an important thing for the state too. When we purchase gold bullion, so a lot of these bills have some wording in them to go back to an analog system of transfer. And I don't want to get off in the weeds with this, but the Federal Reserve, because everything is digital, has the ability to nose around and get right in the middle of every transaction and block it if necessary, just like they did in Canada. And that's a very, very dangerous, vulnerable place to be. And we need an analog system where the Federal Reserve's not in the middle of it. But I personally think that you can look down the road and you can see a train wreck's going to happen here.
Oh, yeah.
And we're not prepared at all for it. And so these gold and silver bills are things to try to lay some foundational planks to keep Tennessee people as solvent as you can when the rest of the world crashes.
So when that happens, so currently we don't have any gold because we haven't passed the bill to where we have anywhere to store the bullion, correct?
No, we actually passed a bill last year to instruct the treasurer to purchase gold bullion, but we didn't put an amount on it. We got this bill coming out here is going to have an amount on it, and it's going to have where it's going to be stored. Yeah.
Okay. So when we buy the initial amount, that'll be enough to get us. That'll be enough to get us rolling.
Yep, I think it'll be a good start, and till we get our own built. And in that process, I failed to mention that Texas prints a commemorative coin. In fact, several of them, and they're made right in Greenville, Tennessee, right up here close to where I live. And there's other countries that make them as well, and they can be used for tender. And they're you can put anything you want to on them. They'll make them the way you want them, and you put them in circulation. And Texas makes, I think, about $2 on every coin, and they turn around and buy gold with that again. And that's in one of these bills, the way we want to do that too.
So if these pass, then let's say people, we can use these before a crash, right? If you get this legislation passed, we don't have to wait till the Titanic actually hits the ice, right?
Well, the state won't have a system for you to buy into yet. We'll be going down the road for the state to purchase and to get it. But you can store gold in other places and run there's one company called Glint. I met the guy from England last week that has that company and that program, and you can purchase gold through that company and run a transactional account on it. It's quite amazing. But I think that's where we're going to have to get to where we can protect as many people as we can, as much as we can.
Yeah. And once again, this is necessary because of how irresponsible and corrupt our federal government is. So our state, I'm glad to see our state stepping up on this and taking precautions for this inevitable problem that we know it's coming. So I hope they take the same approach on the nullification, because surely they can't think that we're going to just through elections fix DC, because DC will never be fixed unless the states fix it, in my opinion.
Yeah, I agree with you. There's so many things, coming at this country. You can't keep up with them. I'm sure you've read about natural asset companies,
Yep.
and
Yep.
they failed that they're on the New York Stock Exchange is a good thing, but those people don't ever quit. They'll just change the name and come back a different way.
Yep.
And so I got a bill trying to stamp that out, and there's I won't talk about that one. That's a little controversial, but
we're not afraid of controversy.
There's a little old bill I got. I ran it 2 or 3 years ago, and I failed in the committee. And I'm going to try it again and see if I can get it passed. But it says that in any retail in-person transaction, if people offer cash, you have to take it.
Good.
Because just for the effort to keep as much cash in circulation as you can.
Right.
And about 25% of your population doesn't even have a bank account, and they don't have a credit or debit card. So, but the tendency to move away from cash bothers me, because I think it's preparation for a central bank digital currency, and that scares me. So,
yeah,
I try to promote circulation of cash as much as I can. But
right. Well, isn't our state pushing Isn't our state? Isn't there somebody pushing a bill right now for the digitalized currency in our state? Isn't there a bill for that this year?
That is I haven't. That's the regular universal commercial code. I think that's being run. It's about 75 pages long. Nobody understands it. Nobody can explain it. That's why I'm saying I've got a bill to try to offset that. I don't know what that bill even does. I can't find anybody who can explain it to me. But there are people that are worried that it is an arm of central bank digital currency. I do not know.
Right. Yeah. Sounds like somebody borrowed that one from DC. Well, hey, thanks for coming on. Thanks for what you do. And we'll definitely be in touch with you during this session, and really hoping to get your nullification bill through, as well as all these bills having to do with real money, which I think we're going to need real soon. But hey, thanks again. Appreciate you. I want to thank everybody for taking the time to watch our program. Please be sure to hit the like and subscribe buttons, as well as the notification bell, to stay informed about our upcoming shows. As a reminder, you can now listen to us on podcast, Spreaker.com. You can find all the audio-only podcasts of your favorite episodes on our website, tninformer.com, or do a search for the Tennessee Informer on Spreaker.com, where you can also download the Spreaker app for Android or Apple phones. Excited to announce the Tennessee Informer podcast are now available to listen to on iHeartRadio, Spotify, Amazon Music, Google Podcast, and several other podcast platforms. Please take a moment to check out and follow our Facebook page at Tennessee Informer. We'll be posting news and information about upcoming shows on there, as well as our website, tninformer.com, where you can also sign up for a weekly newsletter. We're also on Twitter now at twitter.com/tninformer. Please share us with your friends so they can stay up to date on all the conservative political news and issues concerning our state. Our guest next week, February 13th, will be Senator Frank Nicely. He'll be talking more about the bullion and the legal tender issues. So we'll get more in depth on that. Hope you'll join us. That's it for now, and good night from Paris, Tennessee, that is.
He's
Back on as soon as we can, at least